Within a few days, I was summoned for interrogation 3 times. The interrogations were conducted at night, and each time they asked the same questions. And during this time, I had to fill out the interrogation forms 8 times. They were all the same. Something in my camp life as a Polish officer had clearly gone wrong. 10 days later, we were called to an officers' meeting in the barracks where the commanders lived. We took our seats and anxiously stood in front of the uniformed men gathered before us. At a long table sat 3 senior camp commanders. After we had confirmed our names, one of the officers, getting to the heart of the matter, announced that if it turned out that we had actually served in the German army, we would lose our places on the staff of the camp superiors. We answered nothing to this. The officers discussed the answers to the questions on the forms and tried to challenge their veracity, but we insisted on our answers. My heart was beating heavy as it was clear where this was going. In the end, it all proved futile. The NKVD officers of this camp didn't buy our story. My luck changed again. I was stripped of my position as a camp officer and assigned to a labor brigade. The same fate befell Bruno. Before we realized what had happened, we were assigned to work in the factory loading bombs with the other prisoners of war. After announcing their decision, the officers quickly left the room. The 2 escorts standing next to us took us back to our barracks. Our belongings, including the uniforms we were wearing, were confiscated. I was handed a bad-smelling set of clothes: tunic, pants, socks, and boots. I was sure that whoever had worn all this before me was now lying in an earthen pit somewhere on the outskirts of the camp. I didn't say a word. I thought I would be filled with a sense of sadness after having lost so much, but nothing of the sort happened. What I was feeling then was more like determination. I had already managed to avoid death. I had managed to beat the Russians in a deceptive game. I had lived it for so long, and I knew I could win again. I had no time for further thought. It was still early morning, and we were quickly driven to the factory to help the other workers. Despite being in relatively good shape, I was not used to the kind of grueling labor to which I was suddenly sent. It was very hard to lift bombs, and the number of bombs seemed endless. By the time the shift was over, I was completely exhausted. Although the bare wooden bunks on which I had to sleep were unmercifully hard, this did not prevent me from falling asleep immediately. The next 2 days passed very quickly. The daylight hours were filled with monotonous lifting and loading movements. My muscles ached. I found it hard to concentrate on anything but the next bomb going up. Still, I cherished the hope that someday I would be able to get out of here. From time to time, I chose a moment to look around the factory grounds. There were a few sentries watching us at all times, but they were often drunk. The same was true of the guards in the barracks. It gave a chance and instilled hope. 3 days after I was stripped of my position and added to the other prisoners of war, there was a great deal of excitement in the camp. Word quickly spread that we were being transferred to another place. That evening, the factory was deserted, and all able-bodied prisoners were assembled in a large open-air square. The sentries divided us into 5 groups, each lined up in front of a table. One by one, each received a pair of leather boots, similar to army boots. Everyone was also given a pair of wooden shoes. We tried to understand what was going on. After receiving the shoes, everyone went to the next place, the doctor who examined everyone. Those who passed the medical examination were given various kitchen utensils, such as a ladle or a small wok. So I was given a very strange set of items at the end of the procedure. We were ordered to sit on the ground and wait for further orders. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, several guards approached the group of prisoners who were calmly awaiting their fate on the muddy ground and searched the pockets of each of those whom the doctors deemed healthy enough for what lay ahead. In all, approximately 1,700 people were searched. We sat like that in place until evening. The Russians even served us dinner there as well. Shortly after the meal, we learned that the camp administration had started all this to make sure that we were healthy. At 19 o'clock, the convoy ordered us to get up. In a long column, we were chased out of the camp. Convoys followed beside the column every 10 meters. As soon as we reached the road, we were forced to run at a pace that we could barely keep up with. In 20 minutes, we covered 4 kilometers. The run ended at a small train station. It was dark, and I didn't realize if it was the same station I had arrived at on my way to camp number 240. There were many cattle cars along the railroad tracks, and we were loaded into them. The prisoners of war were selected according to nationality. Separate wagons were allocated for Germans, Poles, French, Romanians, Hungarians, and Finns. As soon as the last prisoner was hidden inside, the doors of the wagons were bolted shut and barbed wire was stretched over the windows. We were kept like that for a good hour before the train started. There were so many people crammed into each car that it was impossible to sit down inside, so we stood shoulder to shoulder. It was night and the sky was cloudy, so we couldn't tell which direction we were being taken. Before departing, the escorts brought food and cooking utensils into one of the cars, from which we concluded that it was going to be a long journey. As the train moved forward through the countryside, we were shaken so violently that we often fell on top of each other. Our legs ached, and there was a stench in the air. The constant bumping of our bodies against each other took its toll on our already frayed nerves. I thought to myself that in Germany, even cows travel more comfortably than people in Russia. At dawn, we were able to determine that we were traveling northward. The wagons were warming up quickly from the heat of the sun outside and the mass of bodies crammed inside. By noon, the temperature inside became almost unbearable. Every breath came with difficulty. When passing railroad stations in small towns, the train slowed down and moved almost crawling. Villages stretched along the railroad tracks. As we passed by, people spat in our direction, threatened us with their fists, and threw stones. They shouted, "Death to the Croats," mixed with curses. That day we stopped twice for food. We were given a liter of soup, 600 grams of dry bread, and half a liter of water. But more important than food and drink was the opportunity to be outdoors for the duration of the stop. The guards would kick us out of the car and take us away from the tracks to give us a chance to unload other passengers. As soon as the guards left, we would lie on the ground and gulp greedily for air. The respite lasted exactly for the duration of the food distribution. After a few minutes, the guards would lift us off the ground and push us back into the wagons. The same procedure was repeated the next day and evening. On the third day, the train stopped finally, and we realized that we had finally reached our destination. The Russians kicked us out of the car, but this time they did not give us time to catch our breath. On the tracks were echelons of troops waiting their turn to stop at the station. Convoys quickly drove us off the tracks, and loading us on trucks, brought us to a large square. None of the prisoners spoke, and no one even hinted at what awaited us. As we were led out into the streets, it became clear that we were in a large city that had been heavily damaged by German artillery fire. I began to recognize those places. It was Kiev. 3 years ago, I had had the opportunity to participate in its capture. After the battle was won, we spent 5 days there. How strange it was for me to return here. When we arrived at the large square, I could fully realize what a magnificent spectacle the Russians were preparing here. Along the road, filling the alleys, stood thousands of the city's inhabitants. They gazed with curiosity at the huge masses of ragged people assembled in the vast square of the city. Every 200 meters, mixed with the crowd of civilians, stood tanks whose guns were pointed menacingly in our direction. At every corner, there were machine gun points from which Russian soldiers were watching us closely. On the square, on elevated platforms, huge loudspeakers were installed, through which we were given commands in different languages in which direction to move. The car in which we were being taken stopped. A group of Russian soldiers who were supposed to take care of us immediately approached us. Paying no attention to the mechanical voice from the loudspeaker, I just did what the men in front of me were doing. Under the machine gun muzzles pointed at us, we lined up in the square. I began to realize what was happening. It was a propaganda event. The Russian authorities were using our example to show their people the captured prisoners and what had become of them. We were spoils of war and we all looked terrible. Since we were selected for this event, we were not allowed to shave. We had to look like we had just been brought back from the front lines. It was a performance, a show where we were entrusted with the lead role. We waited patiently in the square in front of thousands of onlookers until the last truckload of prisoners arrived and its passengers took their seats. I raised my head to try to see the full picture. There were a huge number of prisoners gathered here. I estimated about 20,000. I noticed massive photo and movie cameras aimed at us among the civilians, as if they, along with tanks and machine guns, were helping to force us to hold formation. After the last prisoners had taken their seats, the signal was given for the spectacle to begin. The crowd showered us with taunts. In response to the hoarse voices on the loudspeakers, the townspeople shouted and waved their fists. I paid no attention to anything. I just wanted to get back into the slowly creeping train car. I laughed at myself for preferring those cars to the discomfort I felt at that moment. I can't say for sure if it was a feeling of shame, annoyance, or even anger. I think primarily I felt completely crushed. I was part of a team that had been given a task to accomplish and had failed in that task. We were all losers in that square. I was the one who allowed my captors to triumph. Today they had won, but nothing was over for me. I wanted to crawl slowly in that cattle car back to the camp, get back there and survive. As long as I was breathing, the game wasn't over. When the speeches were over, we started moving, but not back to our transportation. Instead, we spilled out into the city streets. Full order was observed, and we were flanked by numerous Russian soldiers, ready to test their weapons on anyone who dared to step away from the columns. We marched in parade formation through the streets of Kiev, a march of 37,000 prisoners of war. There were cameras on every corner with reporters filming the event for the press. The government had declared that day a day off for its citizens so that they could observe the demonstration and be filmed themselves on the streets. I noticed that it was mostly women who had gathered in the streets. Clenching their fists, they shouted something like, "Fritz, first we will rebuild Russia, and then Siberia awaits you." Some women threw stones at us. The column of prisoners marched through the city. It marched through the streets for several hours before we were returned to the station. Then we were loaded back into the wagons like some belongings, and then the train returned us to our prison in the east. We were exhausted, but the cramped conditions of the wagons prevented us from stretching out on the floor. Again clenched on all sides, we rocked back and forth as the train made its way through the fields. The return trip took only 2 days, and we arrived back at our camp near the town of Stalino. The night we returned, I fell asleep very quickly, as for the first time in a long time, I had a chance to lie down and stretch my legs. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to sleep long. At 3 a.m., I was awakened by the jolts of a machine gun barrel by an NKVD officer. He ordered me to get up and follow him. Half asleep, I went out into the street, and the officer followed me closely, nudging me with his elbow. That's how we reached the administration building. Still not thinking clearly, I was placed on a chair in front of a desk where another NKVD officer was sitting, and he said that he had new questions for me. He asked me the same thing over and over again. It was difficult for me to remember that I had answered them before, and after a while I stopped thinking about it. At that moment, I had no idea what they were trying to get from me. It dawned on me. After the interrogation was over, I decided that I would have to continue working at the factory, but even here there was a change. My friend Bruno was told that he would not be returned with me to the factory, but would be assigned to work together with a work brigade of Poles. 3 days later, a new brigade was created in the camp, a penalty brigade under No 50. That's where I was to go. The brigade was commanded by a Jew named Judah Brinkman. Representatives of many nations were gathered there, many of whom had fled their homelands when the SS units came there. The brigade was not allowed to work outside the camp, only within the camp. I learned that the Russian people perceive cleaning toilets as the worst and most humiliating form of punishment. This task was assigned to a brigade of penalized prisoners to clean toilets from sunrise to sunset. The escorts assigned to our brigade were even worse than the others in the camp. It was clear that this was a form of punishment for them as well. The guards seemed to be constantly drunk, which was probably why we were not allowed to go anywhere outside the perimeter of the camp. The state of the guards would have given any of us an easy opportunity to escape. I, unlike the Russians, did not find this labor humiliating. On the contrary, this work was much easier than rolling heavy bombs in a factory all day long. Still, I wondered what the NKVD officers wanted from me. During one of the breaks, I asked the senior Pole assigned to me why I had been assigned to this brigade. He replied that the brigade had just been established and I seemed a suitable candidate for the job. I took that as a compliment. After all, maybe it wasn't a punishment for me at all. On the second day of work, I was happy to learn that my friend Bruno had also joined our unit. I can imagine what he had to do to earn his assignment here. A few days later, there was a new change. Brinkman was stripped of his position as brigadier and I was appointed in his place. It was clear that I had managed to impress someone. This created a lot of gossip in the camp. As usual, I let everyone think what they wanted to think about me. There were now 43 men in the brigade, including 2 German chaplains and the German Lieutenant Albrecht von Buren. I learned that the lieutenant, like me, had traveled on that train to Kiev. A few days after I was appointed brigadier, I tried to clarify somewhat the question of the extent to which the camp administration's confidence in me extended. I asked for an increase in our bread rations, since we had been deprived of the opportunity to work in the factory. We were given an additional 200 grams, but I had to promise that each of us would demonstrate in return what it means to work well. And if they decided at the top that this was not the case, I would receive a 10-year prison sentence. I agreed, but soon realized that the extra 200 grams of bread did not make us stronger. Soon we had to give up the extra rations. Months passed and life in the camp went on as usual. It was the summer of 1944. The weather was warm. The work was unpleasant, but my body coped with it easier than with the hard labor at the factory. The members of my brigade gradually established contact with the civilians who worked in the warehouses. I got to know some of these people as well. Over time, the prisoners established a sort of barter exchange with the civilians. For example, a prisoner could exchange a pair of shoes for 3 kilograms of bread. Some even managed to sell their pants and overcoats. I am not ashamed to admit that I too participated in the camp black market. Once I bargained 200 grams of bread for 5 cigarettes. I even managed to barter a pile of horse dung for bread. It was around this time that I began to feel a real contempt for the Romanians in our camp. I had never trusted or appreciated them highly before, even when we were fighting on the same side. The Romanians in our camp enjoyed more freedom than everyone else. If, for example, a captured Romanian liked the shoes of a captured German and wanted to get them, that same evening in the barracks the Romanian would simply take the shoes away from the German. If the German complained about this to his superiors, he was found guilty and punished. Often Romanians beat Germans for no reason at all, even though they had once been brothers in arms. Soon the Romanians were able to abuse even more Germans. One day, 2,000 new prisoners of war arrived at the camp. They were brought from Bessarabia, where they had been captured by the Romanians. As we were told, they were kept there in unbearable conditions. Romanian troops surrounded the Germans and told them that if they surrendered and turned in their weapons, nothing would be done to them. By that time, the Germans had run out of ammunition and hadn't eaten anything for 6 days, so they gave up their weapons and surrendered themselves. The Romanians immediately grabbed them, robbed them, and abused them. It was much worse than the way the Germans were treated by the Russians. The Romanians gave the prisoners nothing to eat. After keeping the prisoners like this for 4 days, they handed them over to the Russian army. The Russians fed the prisoners, loaded them into wagons, and brought them to our camp. Of the 2,000 that were handed over to the Russians, only half made it to Stalino alive. The rest died on the way, mostly of typhus. Soon after, on October 8, another 982 prisoners arrived at the camp. These too were German prisoners of war captured by Romanian troops. They too suffered from typhus and were immediately quarantined. After 10 days, 836 of them were dead. There was something else about the Romanians that made me despise them. In the camp, it was strictly forbidden to have contact with those who were sick and in quarantine. Despite this rule, many Romanian prisoners of war ignored this prohibition and passed water to their compatriots through the windows. They handed them shoes, overcoats, rings, etc. They often took clothes and other items from the dead and made money by selling it all to civilians. This is how the Romanians lived in the camp, while the Germans were forced to load heavy bombs all day long. After a while, Lieutenant von Baron and I became friends. He had an interesting hobby in the camp. The lieutenant was an artist and painted portraits of Russian officers. For this, he was given bread and smokes. From time to time, he shared his earnings with me. One day, he and I came up with a plan to escape from the camp. As winter approached, we were given new sweaters. We traded them to the civilians for food that we were going to need once we were outside the camp. On December 24, we planned to escape during the works, but 2 days before that, von Byron became seriously ill and was transferred from the weaklings team, and I could not leave the camp without him, so the escape plan had to be postponed. Von Byron took a long time to recover. He spent 4 months on the weak team. I waited patiently for his health to return. We postponed our escape plan, and then a change in my fortunes came again. The camp authorities announced that all Poles would be returned back to the Polish army. Each of the Polish citizens was ordered to report to the administration building for further instructions. This news was brought to me by 3 different people. The information they shared was encouraging, but nothing was known about the date on which the Poles were scheduled to be handed over. Still, it gave me hope that my time in the Russian POW camps would soon come to an end. I was working the night shift. That night, about half an hour after midnight, I went outside when suddenly a ray of light flashed in the sky between the buckets of the Little and Big Dipper. It shone brightly and was beautiful. It went on like that for about 3 minutes. Then the light disappeared, then it appeared again. It happened 4 times. I looked carefully into the sky. I was amazed by this phenomenon, and I was sure it was an omen.